Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History, as we look today at Franklin Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression. Now, in 1932, Herbert Hoover had, I'm sure, no chance of being re-elected, but he ran nonetheless, and lost by the largest margin a president facing re-election had ever suffered. He won only 6 states, and 39.7% of the popular vote. His opponent was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, and also a distant cousin of his own wife, Eleanor, the niece of Franklin Roosevelt, who in fact gave her away at the wedding. While I won't necessarily encourage you to marry your cousins, if you do, and you do it right, she wants to change her name after she gets married. Eleanor was a Roosevelt before and after. And she would play a very important role in Franklin Roosevelt's political career, as well as, of course, in his personal life. For one thing, Franklin Roosevelt had been stricken by polio as an adult, which was unusual. Typically, if you contracted polio, it was as a child. But he got it in early middle age, and it paralyzed him from the waist down. Although he went to great lengths to hide this. While most Americans knew he had polio, the fact that he was paralyzed was hidden. He wore leg braces, which could prop him in a standing position. He could even walk slowly if he went arm in arm with 2 other men, perhaps one of his sons and a member of the cabinet. He could even walk on his own, but then it was pretty obvious he was swinging his legs, straight leg. He built his own wheelchair. He had a special car with hand controls on the steering wheel, so in public he could seem like a fully able-bodied man. And the media played along with this, never photographing him in his wheelchair or being helped into his car or lifted up into his boat in a sling. Franklin Roosevelt, running for election, promised a New Deal for America, although he was deliberately vague as to exactly what this New Deal would be. If Americans wanted to find out, they would have to elect him, and they did. Franklin Roosevelt was sworn in March 4th, 1933, the last time a president would be inaugurated in March, as by now it was felt that 4 months between the election and inauguration was too much, especially in a time of crisis, and of course in a modern age with modern communication like the telegraph and the telephone. And so, fairly early in Roosevelt's presidency, in 1933, the 20th Amendment was ratified, the first of 3 amendments we might connect with Franklin Roosevelt. This moved the presidential inauguration date to January 20th, where it is today. It also moved the new Congress being sworn in to January 3rd. Now, one reason that 4 months of a lame duck period for Hoover was so problematic was Franklin Roosevelt refused to share his New Deal plans with Hoover, who offered to start carrying them out to get something done. FDR wanting to be sure he got credit for anything that worked. In his inaugural address, Franklin Roosevelt assured Americans that he and the government would take care of them, building confidence, saying the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And as president, Roosevelt would collect a very impressive administration around him. His vice president was John Nance Garner IV, nicknamed Cactus Jack Garner, a prominent member of Congress from Texas, brought in to balance out the Democratic ticket alongside the wealthy New Yorker Franklin Roosevelt. Although Cactus Jack always regretted becoming vice president, he stepped down from a very powerful position in Congress. He felt it was worth the risk because after 1 or 2 terms as vice president, he assumed he could then run for president himself. But things didn't quite work out as Cactus Jack hoped. In his cabinet, Roosevelt also tried to balance different regions of the country, different interest groups amongst the Democrats and others. His Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, was a long-serving congressman from Tennessee, born in a log cabin, a Spanish-American War veteran and future winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's brought in two Southerners, both of them know Protestant Christians like himself. For his Secretary of the Treasury, he chose another New Yorker, in fact his neighbor, Henry Morgenthau Jr., but in this case, a Jewish member of the cabinet, to appeal to Jewish Americans, many of whom were often neglected or even openly condemned by other politicians. And as Secretary of the Treasury during and after World War II, Henry Morgenthau would play a particular role in trying to get Jewish refugees to America, not with much success there, and also would try to punish Germany very harshly after World War II, even proposing abolishing Germany as a country, and pushing hard for the execution of Nazi war criminals. But Northern or Southern, all of these men were basically Easterners, Cactus Jack perhaps aside, and all these men were Democrats. For the Secretary of the Interior, he chose a Westerner, Harold Ickes, and, rather than a Democrat, a Republican, a progressive Republican, of course, there still being both progressives and conservatives in both parties, and choosing a Westerner because the Secretary of the Interior is always from the West, where the U.S. government owns most of its land. Now, having chosen Easterners and Westerners, Northerners and Southerners, Christians and Jews, Republicans and Democrats, the time now was for a crazy person. Henry Wallace, who I shouldn't quite dismiss as crazy. In fact, in his own field, Secretary of Agriculture, he was a genius, an agricultural scientist who would develop new types of crops that ended up feeding people around the world. He was also the owner of an important newspaper in his home state of Indiana. But while he'd been raised, I believe, a Presbyterian, as he'd grown older, he had explored other religious views, seeking enlightenment in other religions, including Buddhism, sometimes taking government policy advice from his Buddhist master. While officially a Democrat, at heart he was a socialist. And in addition to being Secretary of Agriculture, would eventually serve as Roosevelt's second vice president from 1940 to 1944. To further balance the ticket, to appeal to a very important Democratic demographic, Roosevelt's Postmaster General was James Farley, a Catholic, indeed eventually knighted by the Pope as a Knight of Malta. He was also, as Roosevelt's campaign manager, the Postmaster General's office was very important to him, there being no branch of the government with more rewards to hand out to supporters than the U.S. Post Office. In terms of balance, if some of these men were Northerners and some of these men were Southerners, some of these men Easterners and some of these men Westerners, some of these men Catholic, some of these men Protestant, some of these men Jewish, one of these men changing his mind frequently, one thing all these men had in common is all of these men were men. Which brings us to the Secretary of Labor. Frances Perkins would be the first woman to serve in the U.S. cabinet and would serve as Secretary of Labor throughout Roosevelt's long presidency. And in addition to all the members of his cabinet, and there are plenty more I have not mentioned, including another Republican for the sake of balance, Roosevelt, like many presidents, had other unofficial advisors too, gathering a group of professional and academic experts known at the time as his Brains Trust to advise him on policy issues and create his New Deal. But while they were known as the Brains Trust primarily during his presidency, they come down to us in history simply as the Brain Trust, a term that's still used for advisors to politicians and others. When Roosevelt came into office, there was great enthusiasm for his New Deal. And his first 100 days, Congress passed many of his ideas into law. Indeed, so much was done in his first 100 days as president that ever since then, presidents have been judged to some extent by their first 100 days. If we have a new president in January or 4 years from now, pay attention to what the media says, as they will certainly look at what he or she accomplishes in the first 100 days. And in many ways, it's a pretty arbitrary yardstick. A person can unquestionably do important things on the 102nd or 301st or 1000th day as president, but the first 100 days has become a measure of presidencies ever since Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was able to communicate many of the ideas Congress was passing into law in his first 100 days and many other issues over the course of his presidency to the American people because he was a master at using radio. While previous presidents had addressed the American people by radio, Roosevelt was very good at making his ideas accessible to the American people, presenting them in a friendly, understandable, almost neighborly way. These periodic radio addresses have come to be known as his Fireside Chats. The idea being he's like your neighbor dropping by to have a chat by the fireside, at least if your neighbor's a wealthy Harvard graduate. But he would come across as someone you could talk to, and someone you might chat with by the fireside in a friendly, neighborly way. Now, as Roosevelt entered the presidency, a new wave of banking failures was sweeping the country. Over 4,000 banks had failed over the past 4 years. And so, to try to stop this, Roosevelt declared within his first couple days as president a 4-day bank holiday, closing all the banks and sending, he said, government auditors into the banks to review their books and make sure the banks had their affairs in order. And when the banks reopened, as almost all were allowed to do, people did not run on the banks, being convinced, rightly or not, that their banks were sound. Indeed, banking reform would be a major part of the New Deal. And a big part of that banking reform was the Glass-Steagall Act, which, among other things, forced big banks to separate, splitting their investment branches from their commercial branches. Your commercial bank, of course, is where most people do most of their banking, their checking accounts, their savings accounts, their home loans, whereas investment banks lend money to big businesses, invest in stocks and other things. And when the stock market had crashed in 1929, the failure of commercial banking had pulled down a lot of, or investment banking had pulled down commercial banking. Now this had to split. It also separated insurance companies from banks. It even broke up the House of Morgan. Although it was so big, it went from being the biggest bank in America to being the 2 biggest banks in America when it was split. Now this rule stood until 1999, when many parts of the Glass-Steagall Act were repealed. And as commercial banks again got into investment banking, investment banks again got into commercial banking, both got involved in insurance, and insurance got back into banking. Many people have blamed that, at least in part, for the financial crisis of 2008. One important part of the Glass-Steagall Act, though, remains in force, as it also created the FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And most of these New Deal programs are known by their initials, and there are so many, and thus so many initials. The New Deal is sometimes described as alphabet soup. Now, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was meant to address one of the main crises of the Depression, runs on banks. Because prior to this, if your bank failed, any money you had not managed to get out was simply lost and gone forever. But today, under the FDIC, banks have to buy insurance from the government, covering most types of bank accounts. And should that bank fail, you will get your money back eventually. At first, it covered your first $2,500, rapidly bumped up to $5,000. Today, it insures your first $250,000. So don't put more than $250,000 in any given bank. Make sure you spread it around. But should your bank fail, you will get your money back. And that gave people a sense of security, so that runs on banks largely ended, people knowing their money was insured. The stock market had been a major cause of the Depression, and the Securities and Exchange Commission was created during the New Deal to try to regulate trading on the stock market, and similar things like the commodities market and the bond market and futures market. Another problem, of course, was that banks were now reluctant to lend money people to buy or build homes, which also hurt the economy. Banks, of course, were worried people couldn't pay off their loans, so the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, was created to regulate interest rates and other rules about home loans. It also insured some mortgages. So if a bank made a loan under the right conditions, they could get insurance from the FHA. And so if the homeowner did not pay off that loan, the bank would get back the value of the loan from the government, so that banks would not be afraid to lend money to home buyers. In the 1960s, the FHA's role would be increased when the government passed a number of rules trying to ban discrimination in lending. And today the FHA is also supposed to make sure banks do not refuse someone a loan based on their race or some other conditions. On April 5th, so just a month into his presidency, Franklin Roosevelt made it illegal for private citizens to own gold. That included foreign citizens with gold held in the United States. There were some exceptions. You could own gold jewelry, you could own collectible coins. Roosevelt himself was a stamp collector, so he understood coin collecting. You could have gold for industrial uses. Dentists, of course, continued to have gold for crowns and fillings. But most gold had to be turned over to the Federal Reserve within a month in exchange for paper money. And people who refused to turn over their gold sometimes had their gold seized by force. And this was just in preparation for the next year, on January 30th, 1934, when the United States completely went off the gold standard. U.S. dollars were no longer backed by a specific amount of gold, although they were directly convertible to gold at a rate of $35 per gold ounce. But that was mostly for purposes of foreign trade. U.S. citizens still could not own gold as an investment for decades to come. The 21st Amendment was ratified in December of 1933, ending nationwide prohibition, although prohibition could continue at the state, county, or local level. And there are still dry towns and counties in some parts of the United States, particularly, although not only, in the South. This was done in part because many people during the Depression felt they needed a drink. It would also create jobs in the brewing and distilling industries. Plus, to pay for the New Deal, which would be awfully expensive, the government needed more money. And while it raised the income tax, it also now wanted to collect the excise tax on whiskey once again. Under Roosevelt, the Indian Reorganization Act, better known as the Indian New Deal, reversed the Dawes Act of the late 1800s, which had tried to break up reservation lands. This Indian New Deal preserved tribal lands and encouraged independent tribal government, encouraging Indians to run their own affairs. Some did so very successfully, some did not. Now, Franklin Roosevelt believed America could not really prosper again until farmers were prosperous, and so he often tried to help rural Americans. The Agricultural Adjustment Act created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and it helped farmers with subsidies, paying farmers to limit their production. And the first year it was in force, even paying farmers to destroy excess produce, which shocked starving Americans when they saw pictures and film footage of farmers pouring out cans of milk, burning piles of grain, slaughtering hogs, and burying them. Many people saw this as immoral. But by limiting farm production, farm prices rose, which did help farmers. And while we like to think of farmers as being independent agents, as Thomas Jefferson imagined them, In reality, ever since the New Deal, farmers have been heavily dependent on the government. The Agricultural Adjustment Act itself was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1937, but was soon replaced by other farm aid programs. In the South, the AAA made tobacco profitable and stable for the first time in years. It eventually even helped cotton prices rise too. But in its push for efficiency, and also its push to reduce overall production, it meant that many farmers no longer needed so many farm workers, or tenant farmers, or sharecroppers. And one unfortunate side effect of the AAA was that many large landowners began evicting sharecroppers and tenant farmers, some of whom formed the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, first based in Arkansas, later in Memphis, and with both white and black members. In 1935, they organized sit-down strikes in the cotton fields, but this didn't work, and Roosevelt largely ignored the problems of tenant farmers and sharecroppers. The New Deal made agriculture profitable again, but mostly for big farmers, not small ones. And this would vastly accelerate a trend going on for a long time of farms becoming more and more consolidated, with only a few farmers owning most of the farmland. Also in 1933, George Norris, a senator from Kansas, took Franklin Roosevelt to visit Muscle Shoals, an area of fast-moving water in the Tennessee River near Chattanooga, and convinced him of the possibilities of damming that waterway. And later in 1933, Congress created the Tennessee Valley Authority, with its headquarters in Knoxville, Tennessee. And the TVA built dams in the Tennessee River Valley, not just on the Tennessee River, but also on rivers flowing into the Tennessee, affecting not just Tennessee, but almost every neighboring state. And this did a number of things. In the short run, it created lots of jobs building these dams, and also jobs in manufacturing, producing the concrete and the steel and the turbines, and other things that went into building the dams. It dispensed water for irrigation. It controlled floods, and flooding had been a serious problem in much of southern Appalachia, especially once all the big forests had been clear-cut by the timber companies, and there wasn't much to hold the water in place. TVA dams helped to control that a lot. TVA agents even went out to southern farmers and taught them better farming methods that would reduce erosion, also helping to control floods. And of course, the Tennessee Valley Authority's dams, being hydroelectric dams, produced lots of cheap electricity for a part of the country that in the past had been technologically pretty backward, bringing many of the comforts of modern life to the rural South, and creating a new market for manufactured goods as Southerners now began buying electric appliances. Now, there were people opposed to TVA, mainly the utility companies in Nashville and Memphis, but some other private companies that provided electricity as well. But the Supreme Court upheld TVA's right to produce and sell power, and eventually most small electric companies in the TVA region just sold their dams and other plants to TVA. However, there was enough opposition to TVA, both locally and in Congress, that no other part of the nation got a similar program. George Norris had always hoped the TVA would just be a test for nationwide programs, with an authority for every major river valley in the country. But in the end, it ended pretty much with TVA. All the U.S. government did build individual dams here and there under other programs. The goal of bringing electricity to other rural areas would be carried out by the REA, or Rural Electrification Administration. The National Recovery Act, or NRA, or sometimes you'll see NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, set for the first time minimum wages so that workers could make more money. It also set minimum prices so that struggling companies could not undercut each other, hoping to create both a fair wage for the worker and a fair price for the businessman. However, it also created a lot of regulations that both business owners and their employees hated. Its attempt to solve disputes between bosses and workers often failed. And in the end, the NRA was mostly struck down by the Supreme Court, declaring many parts unconstitutional in 1935 in what's officially called the Schechter Poultry Corporation versus United States case, but usually remembered as the sick chicken case. The Schechter brothers being accused of selling diseased chicken from their meatpacking plant. But while the Supreme Court didn't, I presume, like diseased chicken, they did declare that the Schechter Poultry Corporation conducted most of its business within its home state and did not conduct enough interstate commerce for Congress to regulate it. And so, this case led to the overturning of most of the NRA, and overall, it was viewed as a failure. Although one agency it created, the Public Works Administration, did hire private contractors, so hired other businesses to build dams and bridges and tunnels and other public works throughout the 1930s, again helping small construction businesses stay afloat and keeping their workers employed. But the private sector, even with government help, would turn out not to be enough, or so Roosevelt felt. And so the government began to create their own make-work programs to directly employ people. Although it would have been easier for the government just to hand out money directly, and occasionally it did, for the most part Roosevelt and his advisors felt that there was more dignity in working for your living that also helped to maintain a work ethic and sense of responsibility, as well as that sense of satisfaction in the people employed by the government. One of the biggest and probably the most popular of all these make-work programs was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which employed young men in military-style organizations. They lived in barracks out in the wilderness. They had uniforms, or they typically just wore work clothes. They mainly built parks. They cut part of the Appalachian Trail, but they built many other national parks and facilities there, like rangers' offices and public bathrooms and so on. They fought forest fires. They undertook other outdoor projects. Good, healthy outdoor activity for young men, and their wages were often sent home to their families to keep them out of trouble. Again, probably the biggest, probably the most popular of all the New Deal programs of its time. And the CCC, as they constructed facilities at national parks, had plenty to do, as Roosevelt set aside about 12 million acres of land as national parks, more land than any other president, except, of course, his cousin Theodore. Among the national parks created during the New Deal would be the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, today the most visited of all national parks in America. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration lent money to states to try to fund smaller local make-work programs there, and in some cases even programs of direct relief through handouts of cash or food or clothing. Although again, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins, one of his advisor in charge of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and later some other make-work programs, and eventually as Secretary of Commerce, did, as I mentioned, feel it was better to help Americans work than offer direct relief. But again, sometimes the Federal Emergency Relief Administration's money even went to direct relief programs. Some other make-work programs included the Civil Works Administration, and a bit later, the much larger Works Progress Administration, both of them also led by Harry Hopkins. In one of Roosevelt's most influential advisors in the New Deal, having also advised him in state-level relief experts when he'd been governor of New York before becoming president. Both the CWA and the WPA built public works to create jobs for the unemployed, building dams, bridges, highways, power plants, government buildings. If you've been to a football game in Bristol, Tennessee, and seen the Stone Castle where they play football, that was built by the WPA, as was Science Hill's old football stadium downtown. The WPA, which again was even more ambitious than the CWA, which it replaced in 1935, even employed the truly unemployable, such as artists and academics. If the WPA was building government buildings, they would also hire artists to decorate them inside. The WPA painted murals in many government buildings, especially post offices, had WPA murals. They created statuary and other works of art. They even hired historians to go around and interview former slaves. Even now, in 1935, there were some people still alive who had been born as slaves and distantly remembered what that was like. And the WPA interviewed them. And while their memories may have been a bit limited, the WPA slave narratives have been a very important resource for historians ever since in trying to learn about life under slavery, because prior to this, nobody had ever really cared to ask them very much. The Wagner Act, passed in 1935, was meant to help the working class. It recognized the rights of workers in all industries to join unions. Even at this point in 1935, there were some industries that had not been unionized. Unions had been banned. But the Wagner Act said unions were legal in all industries. It also created the National Labor Relations Board, which is still around, to try to work out disputes between business and labor, and partly to try to solve some of the issues the National Recovery Administration had not been able to deal with effectively. Now, for all that many different people were suffering poverty, there was perhaps one group that was more insecure than any other. That group, of course, being old people. Once you were too old to work, you had to depend on your children to take care of you. But during the Depression, some might not be able to do that. They might be unemployed too, or they might be far away, or they might just be good for nothing. Or perhaps you didn't have children at all. Perhaps you had savings, but maybe you lost them. And poverty and economic instability were a serious problem for the elderly of all races and in all parts of the country. And there had been some plans to deal with this in the past. A very popular plan in the 1930s had been proposed by Dr. Francis Townsend, a retired doctor in California. The Townsend plan that he proposed would have created a national sales tax, and that tax would have let the U.S. government pay every American age 60 or older $200 a month, which in those days was a fair amount of money. But there's an interesting condition on those $200. They had to be spent every month so that the economy would kind of be stimulated by this constant spending of $200 or more each month by old people. They also did have to stop working to receive that $200 a month, thus freeing up jobs for younger people seeking work. But while Roosevelt was inspired by the Townsend Plan, the Social Security Act, which he got Congress to pass in 1935, was much less generous. Rather than a national sales tax, it was funded by a payroll tax, so that people working today have part of their money going to pay the Social Security of people retired today. but they in turn will have their retirement paid for by somebody working well down the road, at least hopefully. Furthermore, you can collect Social Security at 60, but at 65, and rather than $200 a month at first, it was only $20. But for many people, better than nothing. And that $20 did rise over time. Of course, to pay for all this, the government went deep into debt. The deficit, the difference between the money we make and the money we spend, increased nearly 10 times during Roosevelt's first term. But some economists were beginning to say that maybe this was okay. Most famously, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was beginning to argue that during times of crisis, governments needed to spend money. He described this as priming the pump. And today, if you mow your yard or operate maybe your weed eater or chainsaw or something, before starting the engine, perhaps you push a little button to squirt some gasoline into the engine, thus priming the engine. Then, once the engine started, its own fuel pump can take over. I don't think Keynes ever mowed his own yard, and if he did, they didn't have gas-powered mowers then. But there are also water pumps that work in the same way, and that I think is what he had in mind. He said the government, in times of crisis, should put money into the economy to prime the pump, to stimulate the economy, getting money into the hands of the average person who can then spend and thus get business going again. As business grows, they'll employ more people. As they employ more people, they'll buy more stuff. Businesses will produce more and employ more, and eventually things will be solved. At that point, Keynes said, governments could cut off spending and raise taxes, which he said should be cut during a crisis. Now, governments have, ever since the 1930s, often followed Keynesian economics, often raised spending and cut taxes during times of crisis, but it's usually worked out that once times got good again, they were reluctant to cut back on spending very much. This has tended to run into a lot of debt, possibly maybe necessary during a crisis, maybe not during other times. Some people even question Keynes on this. The British politician Winston Churchill said, "Won't this catch up with us eventually?" Keynes supposedly responded, "By then, you and I will be dead." Planning for the future. And people worried too that the welfare state that this might create would sap Americans of their work ethic and their initiative and a sense of personal responsibility. But that danger and the danger of debt, Roosevelt said, was necessary because the problems facing America were so numerous and so immediate. Saying in one speech to a meeting of Democratic leaders, "Here is 1/3 of a nation, ill-nourished, ill-clad, ill-housed now. Here are thousands upon thousands of farmers wondering whether next year's prices will meet their mortgage interest now. Here are thousands upon thousands of men and women laboring for long hours in factories for inadequate pay now. Here are thousands upon thousands of children who should be at school, working in mines and mills now. Here are strikes more far-reaching than we have ever known, costing millions of dollars now. Here are spring floods threatening to roll again down our river valleys now. Here is the Dust Bowl threatening to blow again now. If we would keep faith with those who have faith in us, if we would make democracy succeed, I say we must act now." And while many conservatives criticize this, there were many who felt it was necessary. Congress at first passed many of his ideas into law, but did, under criticism, begin to ease back. And many of his New Deal programs were passed in his first 100 days in 1933, although in 1935, after even more Democrats had been elected to Congress, a second New Deal implemented more programs, including some of his biggest, like the WPA and Social Security. There were those, even in his own party, who were unhappy. In 1934, for example, the American Liberty League was founded primarily by conservative Democrats, including both the 1924 and 1928 Democratic presidential candidates, John Davis and Al Smith. And they opposed Roosevelt partly for ending prohibition, and they said attacking private property by trying to control industry and redistributing wealth for the taxes it paid for his welfare and make-work schemes. Indeed, many liberals, particularly socialists, though, said the reverse, that Roosevelt was passing up an important chance to truly reform or even replace the capitalist system. Although that was partly Roosevelt's idea. He said his goal was to reform capitalism to save it from itself, and to have moderate reforms so that people would not turn to socialism or communism out of desperation. There were others, though, and not necessarily communists, who said Roosevelt had not gone far enough. One of his most outspoken critics was the Catholic radio preacher, Father Charles Coughlin. Although at first he supported the New Deal, he soon came to say it wasn't going far enough. He promoted on his radio program and through a magazine a program of social justice. And while he condemned Roosevelt for being too communist in some ways, he had some rather socialist-sounding ideas of his own. He wanted the government to nationalize the banks and the utilities. Some private property he wanted to protect, but some things he said the government should run. He also wanted to base the economy on silver. We'd mostly moved off the gold standard, but not entirely. He wanted a return to free silver. In some ways, much of the populist program from the 1890s. But while wanting to nationalize some things, he was overall very fervently anti-communist, in part because the communist Soviet Union was so strongly anti-religious. He was also very outspoken in his anti-Semitism. One reason to nationalize the banks, he said, was so that the Jews who ran them could no longer manipulate the economy. And as he criticized Roosevelt more and more, he was eventually forced to stop broadcasting. The Catholic Church quietly supported Roosevelt shutting down his broadcast, as they saw him as embarrassing but too popular to stop themselves. He particularly went too far when, in the late 1930s, he didn't just criticize Roosevelt, but said, why can't you be more like those guys in Europe, Hitler and Mussolini, who have so many good ideas? Another of Roosevelt's critics was Huey Long, governor of Louisiana, and later a senator from Louisiana, who wanted to share the wealth, to place very high taxes on the wealthy, a marginal income tax. So anyone making $1 million a year paid 1%. Anyone making $2 million would pay 2% on their second million. Your third million would be taxed at 3%, and so on up. So making $100 million or more, everything above $100 million would be taxed at 100%. He said this was to share the wealth and give that money to the poor, to a guaranteed minimum annual income, so a guaranteed basic income, as well as making sure everyone could own their own home, their own car, and their own radio. He also wanted to build public works like schools and roads. He supported free public education. He wrote the fight song for Louisiana State University that they still use. Built the tallest state capitol building in Baton Rouge. One reason, of course, he built so many things with concrete was he had friends with interests in the concrete business. Still, he had grown up poor, and his program was very popular with many poor people in Louisiana and eventually around the country. He was nicknamed the Kingfish after a character in the popular radio program Amos and Andy. At first, he did support Roosevelt's New Deal, but later he opposed it, partly saying it didn't go far enough, and partly because Roosevelt didn't trust him and made sure that all the New Deal money in Louisiana was handled by his political opponents. Long considered running for the presidency himself, either in 1936 or 1940, but didn't get to do this because he did make many enemies in Louisiana and by punishing his rivals, and also through extensive corruption. He required every government employee, for example, to contribute to his own re-election fund, hidden in a secret deduct box. Even once he was in the Senate, he tried to control Louisiana politics until he was assassinated in 1935 by someone whose relative he treated badly politically. Although we don't know a lot about the man who shot him, Huey Long's bodyguards pulled out the machine guns and gunned the assassin down. As Huey lay dying in the hospital over the next 2 days, all his political friends came to see him, asking him, "Huey, where's the deduct box?" But apparently he never told anyone where he hid the money. Still, while Roosevelt was criticized by many people, by conservatives, and by people more liberal than himself, he was nominated for a second term in 1936 to run against the Republican candidate Alf Landon, who himself was from the liberal wing of the Republican Party, Republicans feeling that Roosevelt was so popular that their best approach would be to say they would do basically the same things, but better. But people apparently felt they'd rather have a real Roosevelt than a pretend Roosevelt. And the election of 1936, Roosevelt won 46 out of 48 states, everywhere but Maine and Vermont. But he still had opponents, including in the most conservative branch of the government, the one where you're there for life. As the U.S. Supreme Court, under the leadership of Charles Evans Hughes, had already overturned some parts of the New Deal, like the National Recovery Act. They now overturned the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and seemed likely to overturn other New Deal programs. And so Roosevelt came up with a way to deal with this. Because, according to the U.S. Constitution, how many members of the Supreme Court are there? It doesn't say that, but also doesn't say 9. The Constitution does not say how many members of the Supreme Court there are. It says in Article 3 that Congress will decide. And so while it has been a tradition since the mid-1800s to have 9 members of the Supreme Court, there is no legal reason Congress could not pass a law putting more judges on the Supreme Court, or possibly limiting the Supreme Court to a lower number. They couldn't kick anyone off, but they could say that when someone dies or retires, he would not be replaced until a lower number was reached. And so Roosevelt said, since these guys are there for life, a lot of them are old and probably need help. So maybe it would be a nice favor to them if Congress would add additional justices to assist any judge who was too old. Under a scheme that would have added up to 6 more judges to the Supreme Court. This was described as Roosevelt's court-packing plan, and there was a lot of opposition to this. Even among Roosevelt's normal supporters, this was seen as going too far. It might technically be legal, but was too big an attack on custom and tradition. However, it frightened the court enough that some older conservative justices retired, and others decided to maybe be more open to some New Deal plans. And even before this, the court had upheld some plans, as well as overturning some. Certainly after this, the New Deal was largely accepted by the U.S. Supreme Court. And over time, as justices did die or retire, Roosevelt got to replace more and more, shaping the court in his own image, without having to use this court-packing plan. Still, in his second term, Roosevelt was not able to pass nearly as many or as drastic programs as he had in his first term. There is no third New Deal. but he did pass some important laws. For example, in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act banned child labor. And in this case, the Supreme Court upheld that law. It created a nationwide minimum wage of 25 cents per hour, which even then wasn't a whole lot, but it was still more than many people were making. And over time, of course, that 25 cents an hour would rise. It created a 44-hour maximum work week, beyond which you would have to be paid overtime. This would help the individual worker, and it would also force companies to hire more workers to take up the slack. And speaking of workers, the American Federation of Labor continued to represent skilled workers, but for the most part not unskilled workers. But during the Depression, unskilled workers formed their own organization, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which organized a successful strike against the General Motors Company in Flint, Michigan, a big sit-down strike forcing General Motors to pay CIO workers more. And between 1930 and 1940, the number of union members doubled, as Roosevelt was fairly supportive of the working class and union membership, and many workers were desperate for all the help they could get from each other. Now, one of Roosevelt's most important political aspects in creating the welfare state was his wife, Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt traveled the country, she being able to walk, so she could travel much more easily than her husband. She visited the homes and the workplaces of the working class and the poor, even African Americans and Latinos and American Indians. She strongly opposed sexism and racism, hoped to win equality, or at least something closer to equality, for women and blacks and other groups discriminated against, always pushing her husband further to the left. And the New Deal did help black Americans in many ways. Roosevelt even had a black cabinet and of unofficial black advisors. And under their influence and the influence of other civil rights activists, including his wife Eleanor, Roosevelt did insist that the New Deal employ black workers equally with white workers in programs like the WPA and the TVA, both of which we see in the slide, and others too. Although, even with that insistence upon equality of employment, there was still discrimination. In TVA work camps in the South, white workers and black workers were housed in separate camps close to the work site, but didn't live side by side. So still not nearly full equality, but closer than before. Furthermore, Roosevelt refused to support anti-lynching laws for fear he would turn Southern Democrats against them, and every Democrat depended on the solid South for political power. Furthermore, the Agricultural Adjustment Act and other government subsidies to big farmers that encouraged them to grow less and thus evict sharecroppers from their land, particularly hurt small black farmers, many of whom were sharecroppers or tenant farmers, although there were many poor white farmers who were hurt as well. Despite these issues, Roosevelt did bring African Americans into the Democratic Party. Up to this point, if black people had been able to vote at all, they voted for the party of Lincoln. By the 1930s, many were starting to say, what had the Republicans done for them lately? And many felt it hadn't been much. And while Roosevelt's New Deal had maybe not done quite as much for black people as it had for some others, simply by helping the unemployed, it helped many black people a lot, as they particularly suffered from unemployment. And so this brought African Americans from the Republican Party into the Democratic Party very quickly and in very large numbers. But Roosevelt still held on to all the traditional Democratic supporters, farmers, the working class, immigrants, and others. And this New Deal coalition would be so powerful it would form the basis of a fifth two-party system. After 40 years or more in which the Democrats had been weak, they would now hold the majority in the House of Representatives for all but 4 years, between 1933 and 1995. They would hold the presidency for all but 8 years, between 1933 and 1969. They would control the Senate for much of that period as well. In creating a fifth two-party system in America that would last for decades, although its end would be less obvious or dramatic than the conclusion of other two-party systems in America. Unlike all the other two-party systems, picking an end date for the fifth two-party system is much harder. It will last at least till 1968, arguably up till 1994. And unquestionably, Roosevelt became the most powerful president up to this time, and set standards all subsequent presidents have tried to follow, from measuring their terms by the first 100 days to having to be media stars on radio and later television, and eventually coming to be seen as the leader of the free world itself. Still, Roosevelt's second term was much harder than his first. His court-packing scheme failed. There was less support for continuing, and certainly no support for expanding the New Deal, and the Depression dragged on. There were ups and downs throughout the 1930s, but there was actually a big surge in unemployment, a so-called Roosevelt Recession in 1937 to 38, in the first half of his second term, when unemployment got up to 20%. Not as bad as it had been in 1933, but still pretty bad. Furthermore, the New Deal had achieved its successes through a vast enlargement in the government and its powers, involving many more people's lives, and while helping many people, arguably making many people dependent on a welfare state. And for all its many accomplishments, the New Deal would not truly bring an end to the Depression. The government program that would bring full employment would not be the TVA or the CCC or the CWA or the PWA. Rather, during World War II, it would be the Selective Service Act.